here. And it is a huge pleasure to introduce you to our reader today. I have followed her work for years, and I've seen it as a testament to how a writer can write about what she knows and write about what she doesn't know, how she can come to know what she doesn't know, come to know herself and bring us to a place where we discover what we didn't know and recognize it as integral to our own worlds. Let me clarify what I mean. Roxana Robinson's first few books received well-deserved praise that might have been seen as limiting her purview. For her story collections, A Glimpse of Scarlet, Asking for Love, and A Perfect Stranger, and for her novels, This Is My Daughter and Sweetwater, she received reviews that spoke of her elegance, her graceful prose, her charting the terrain of the quote-unquote well-versed and well-off, her role as a, quote, perceptive chronicler of the WASP life, her, quote, investigation of the upper crust. Described as domestic fiction with bite, her work earned comparisons to John Cheever, Henry James, and Edith Wharton. Then she wrote the novel Cost, which brought into the orbit of Roxana's attention the question of heroin addiction, several years before we began noticing how thoroughly that epidemic is plaguing young people at all levels of society. In reviewing that book, which made several lists for Best Book of 2008, including the New York Times editor's pick, Leah Hager-Cohen points out how Roxana Robinson chronicles the tremendous struggle to connect that can make or break a character's life. And then, in 2013, she gave us Sparta, which is for sale right over there on the table. She gave us Sparta, the deeply human story of a young Marine just returned from his final tour of duty in Iraq. These books, like her others, are about family, about what breaks and what holds in this most intimate and most vital of worlds. But as the book list review of Sparta noted, quote, Robinson's diligently researched and profoundly realized tale of a warrior's trauma and his family's struggle to help him is a beautifully incisive, respectful, suspenseful, and indicting drama of our failure to grasp the full toll of war. Diligently researched and profoundly realized. It's this joining of discovery and revelation that marks Roxana Robinson's most recent work and makes it urgently relevant to a time when today's main New York Times headline, just today, asked whether a shoot-up by an ex-Marine in an Iraqi restaurant in Oregon was caused by hate or PTSD. Roxana Robinson's awards have included NEA and Guggenheim Fellowships and the James Webb Award for Sparta. She has served the literary community generously with a long list of reviews and essays on the writing life and as president of the Authors Guild. She teaches in the MFA program at Hunter College and occasionally just down the road at the Wesleyan Writers Conference. Please join me in welcoming her to Trinity.
Thank you for that eloquent introduction. It is a great pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to be among writers, and this is a particularly welcoming community, so thank you for inviting me. I am going to read a story, if I can find it, called At the Beach, which is in this collection, Perfect Stranger. My wife put Jennifer into the car seat in back, and then she climbed into the front seat next to me. Her hair was in a long braid, and she wore a flowered sort of beach dress over her bathing suit. She shut the car door without speaking. All set? I asked. It was a general question, but Diana didn't answer or look at me, so I looked at Jennifer in the rearview mirror as though I were talking only to her. You all set back there, young lady? Yes, I am, Daddy, Jennifer promised. I had known Diana wouldn't answer. She hadn't spoken to me in nearly 2 days, since Thursday night. Or looked at me, really. I couldn't remember a fight that had gone on this long. We were in the car for only a few minutes. We were only a mile or so from the beach, down small sandy back lanes. It was already hot, and the sky was very blue and cloudless, A perfect beach day. When we reached the parking lot, it was full, of course. This was Eastern Long Island, August. Row after row of cars were parked in the sandy lot, surrounded by dune grass. I wondered if I'd have to park illegally along one of the side roads and risk a ticket. But as I turned down the last row, I saw the taillights of a little red car turn bright, and I stopped just in time. "Lucky," I said. No one answered me, and I began to whistle, pretending that I didn't notice this lack of response as the little red car slid out in front of me. When it had pulled away, I pulled neatly into its slot and turned off the engine. "Here we are, kiddos," I said. I looked into the mirror again to find Jennifer watching alertly. She had wide blue eyes and pale skin that looked so fresh it was impossible to believe it could be 4 years old. It looked just born, smooth and sweet. I smiled at her and winked. "Hi, kiddo," I said. "I'm not kiddo, Daddy," she said reprovingly. "Oh, well, pardon," I said the word in a French accent. "Who are you then?" Jennifer hesitated for a moment. "I'm Bathsheba," she declared, closing her eyes regally. "Oh, I see," I said. "Well, I'm very glad to meet you, Bathsheba." I bowed my head politely. Diana ignored us, climbing out of the car and leaning into the back to help Jennifer with the car seat. "Let's get you out of this," she said to Jennifer, as though they were alone in the car. There was a path through the dunes, and as we walked along it, the tall beach grasses moved in the sea wind against our bare legs, light and slithery and yielding, but sharp, each narrow blade a cutting edge. I carried the hamper and the umbrella. Diana held the beach bag and Jennifer's hand. "Here's the beach, Jen. Here we are at the beach," Diana said. Her voice was bright, but it was pitched low so that only Jennifer would be able to hear it, though I could, just barely. I was walking behind them. There wasn't room for the three of us abreast on the path. Diana kept talking to Jennifer as we made our way along the hot sand. Usually, when we fight, Diana gets mad and she stops speaking to me. Then I stop speaking to her, and there's a sudden, stubborn silence between us, fixed and solid, a wall. But I don't stay angry as long as Diana does. After a few hours, my anger begins to drain away, water sinking into sand. The heat goes out of me. The fight loses its point. I can't remember why I was so angry. And then I want the wall down. I want to be in the same world with Diana again. I make an overture. I touch her skin, her smooth shoulder, or her cheek. I say something, and then she turns to look at me, and then the walls we've built between us collapse, sliding down into nothing. But this time it wasn't going to happen. I wasn't going to make the first advance. I'm always the one to do it. And why should the burden always be on my shoulders, as though I'm the only one who cares about this marriage, as though it's only my responsibility to make it work? This time I determined not to do it. It's Diana's marriage too, and this time it was her turn. I was determined to wait for her to make the first move. That morning I'd been standing in the kitchen, my cup of coffee in my hand, looking out the window. Diana was in Jennifer's room getting her dressed, and I could hear them laughing about something. They started with low, voluptuous giggles, taking turns, their voices sliding into each other, egging each other on, and then becoming long drifts of helpless laughter. The sound was so loose and luxuriant, so swelling and overflowing and delicious, that I found myself smiling, starting to laugh, just from the sound of them together. I knew exactly what they looked like. Jennifer rolling on the bed, Diana leaning over her, maybe tickling her small, frantic body. The two of them raucous, hilarious, tender, all those smooth female limbs twisting and intertwined. I wanted to go in and stand there with them, and I thought that if I did, Diana would look up at me, her eyes warm and lit up, and the fight would be over, and we'd be together again. I was looking out the window, starting to smile as I listened, and I began to turn around. But then I remembered the night before, and the irritating way Diana had stood at the kitchen counter, drinking from a mug and reading a magazine with her back to me, turning the pages and stirring her tea as though she didn't even know I was in the room. I remembered how stubborn she was being and how she could only see things from her point of view, and I hardened myself to the laughter. One of us would have to give in on this, and Diana, as always, thought it should be me. I thought of this arrogant assumption, and my outrage rose up again, and I told myself I would not make the first move, and I stood waiting by the window until Diana brought Jennifer out, dressed. At the beach, we always walked east to get away from the crowds, but of course in August there are hardly any beaches on Long Island without crowds. We walked for a while until the houses had thinned out. Where we finally settled, it wasn't empty. There were 15 or 20 groups of people scattered around on the sand with folding chairs and big umbrellas and picnic coolers, but we weren't right next to anyone, as the beach was very wide there. It was beautiful. Pure white, fine sand, a long straight line of it for miles. The beaches of southern Long Island are as good as any in the world. You could stand at the high edge of that beach and see the long, slow reach to the horizon in either direction. Nothing interrupting that brave, clean stretch into the far point of distance. The pitch of the shore sloped down sharply at the water's edge, and the surf was high that day. The waves were big, and they started cresting 50, 80, 100 feet out, and then they came riding high and angry all the way in, curling themselves down in a rolling explosion that thundered along the beach, and the smaller waves rushed mindlessly up along the broad, dark patch of sand. Small stones, seaweed, shells washed helplessly back and forth in the shallows. The sound of it all was powerful, the long gathering weight, and then the crash, the rumble, and the small flooding rush. Then a wait, and then another crash. We settled ourselves high up on the beach, away from those pounding waves. We were in a relatively empty patch. The closest people were 10 or 15 feet away, another family with a small son. The mother was a thin, dark-haired young woman in a black bikini. She lay flat on her back, her eyes closed against the sun. The son, S-O-N, was nearby, playing in the sand with a plastic tank. The father sat beneath the umbrella, reading a magazine. He was dark-skinned and furry-chested, wearing a white tennis hat with a wavy brim. He stared at us from behind his sunglasses as we set up camp. I pushed the shaft of our umbrella as deep into the sand as I could, and when it felt solid, I opened it up. The big striped wings lifted creakily above me like a mechanical bird, and a patch of dry shade hovered over the burning ridges of sand. I took out our towels from the beach bag. "Here's your towel, Miss Beth Sheena," I said to Jennifer. Jennifer pursed her mouth, restraining her smile. "Thank you very much, Daddy," she said. She took it from me with a little flounce, her eyebrows lifted, her eyelids lowered. Little girls flirt, even very little girls. And of course I flirted right back with her. How could I not? She was delicious, delectable, my sweet little morsel of a daughter. Diana was not looking at us, but she was watching, I knew, out of the corner of her eye. She spread out her own towel on the other side of the umbrella. "Do you want to be over here with me, Jen? With Mummy?" I thought this was mean-spirited of her, enticing my daughter away. "Come over here and let me put sunscreen on you." Clutching her towel in one hand like a miniature starlet, trailing it behind her, Jennifer trundled obediently over. She stood meekly while Diana, frowning in the sun, squeezed a white coil of lotion into her palm and rubbed it into Jennifer's soft backs, making the angel wings rise and fall. I settled down on my towel. I was sitting up, my arms around my knees, looking around. I set a small smile on my face, general and nonspecific, so that if anyone were to look over at us, we would look like a comfortable domestic group, peaceable and united. We were in an area of all families, and I thought about how my inner sense of direction had shifted. 6 or 7 years ago, still single, I'd have found myself on a beach full of nubile young women, nearly naked, stretched out on the beach in pairs, waiting to be approached. Now things have changed. I don't even know where those beaches are. I don't really care either. But thinking about my wholehearted and virtuous fidelity to Diana, about my commitment to our marriage, roused my outrage at her again. How could she take this for granted? How dared she? I could find those beaches again. Here, where we were, there were lots of children around Jennifer's age, staggering around on the sand with buckets and shovels. Down on the long slope by the water, there were parents sitting with their children, digging at the liquid sand, building fanciful, brief-lived castles. Diana came over to the beach bag, which was next to me. She leaned down to reach it, and suddenly I felt her body beside me, shading me from the sun. I could feel the cool relief of her presence. I could smell the suntan lotion she used. Right beside me were her long thighs, the warm color of honey, with that smooth, shallow groove running down the sides. I knew exactly how they felt to the touch. I remembered them under my fingers. "Hi," I said to her softly, looking up as though we were lovers. Just an impulse. Diana's face was set. It was granite. She didn't answer or even look at me. I could feel determined indifference radiating from her, burning and deadly like the sun. It shocked me. Up until then, I'd been thinking only of myself in this. I'd been thinking that peace was available as soon as I wanted it. Whenever my exasperation cooled, it would simply be a matter of my making a move. But now, seeing how set her mouth was, how cool and fixed and neutral her gaze, I felt things starting to slide away from me. It felt like that draining backwash of the surf, that rush which you're powerless to resist. And I wondered if this was going to be the way things were going to be for us. Maybe it was too late for me to make a move. Suddenly it seemed really bad, and I wondered if we'd gone too far. If I'd gone too far during the fight, if I'd said things that could not now be forgiven. I knew I'd been unkind. Last night, Diana, in her nightgown, had closed herself into the bathroom before she came to bed. After she'd brushed her teeth and turned off the water, there was silence. She didn't come out, and after a while I became aware of this, and I put down my book to listen. I could hear her weeping. It was very faint, a quiet whispering sound, a staccato series of coughing sighs. A long breathing pause, and then the little coughing sighs again. Later, I'd had to hold my breath to be sure of what I was hearing. Later, when she came out of the bathroom, her eyes were changed, hooded, and hurt, as they are after crying. She didn't look at me. I lay in bed and held my book up, looking straight ahead as though I hadn't heard and didn't see. It was her turn to make a move. She got into bed with her back to me, and we went to sleep without speaking. At the time, I'd thought angrily, fine, let her know how it feels. Let her decide how to end it. But now I thought, what if this time I've lost the right I've always had to end the fight? Our fights had never lasted this long before. How bad do things get before they're too bad to fix? I began to wonder if Diana had made some decision of her own, some hostile conclusion that would slowly force me out of our life, into exile, banning me from her forever. I'd always believed that she was in my life for good, but what if I was wrong? What if the fight was the beginning of some terrible unraveling? What if this bright day was something we'd remember forever, as a foreshadowing, darkened later by pain? I said nothing more, and she moved away, back to Jennifer. I saw her give Jen a big smile. Her face still worked, apparently, only not toward me. That smile grieved me, and I began to be frightened of what might happen. I had a cave-like feeling in my chest, a hollowness I didn't know how to deal with. So I lay down on my back and closed my eyes and pretended to go to sleep. Of course you can't go to sleep like that with the hot August sun beating right down into each of your eyes separately, as though it's two mad searchlights. Even with your eyes shut, the light drills in at you, turns your eyelids hot and red inside. Still, right then there was nothing I wanted to see, so I kept my eyes shut. I heard Diana talking to Jennifer for quite a long while, and Jennifer answering. They were kneeling, busy, building a castle together, right there where we were, high up on the beach, with that useless, grainy, dry, collapsing sand. I would have gotten up and taken Jen down toward the waves and built one with the soft, liquid sand along the waterline. We would have built a much better castle down there. But I knew it would have been seen as antagonistic, my taking Jennifer away from Diana, and of course I knew Diana wouldn't come with us. I lay in the sun without moving, my eyes shut, listening to the heavy crash of the surf and the cries of the children and the ill-bred squalls of the gulls. I don't know when I first heard the call. Maybe I actually did sleep for a bit, because when I became aware of it, I realized I'd been hearing it for a while. Urgency abounds along the seaside. Children scream with sudden intensity. Parents shout alarmingly for them to do something or not to do it. It's the turbulence in the air, the surf, the big distances, the shrieking gulls, so many people running and splashing. Turbulence is all around you, and you respond with shrillness and urgency. So when I heard the calls, "Annie! Annie!" At first I didn't pay attention, but something in the tone was disturbing, and I sat up, leaning back on my elbows to watch. A woman was running along the beach at the lip of the sand where it started to slope sharply down to the water. She had dark, bushy hair and sunglasses. She was in her late 30s, with a thick waist. She wore a red bathing suit with a broad blue diagonal stripe across the front. She was running, not fast, but somehow desperately, and her hands were clenched into fists. On one wrist, a gold bangle glinted in the sun. Her feet pounded heavily into the sand. As she ran, she kept looking around and around, as though she would run faster, but she didn't know what direction she should take. "Annie! Annie! Annie!" By now, she was abreast of us, and in her voice, it was clear, there was terror. I sat up, roused by that dreadful unbidden stab, and looked around, from side to side. Everyone nearby was doing the same. People were sitting up, getting onto their knees, frowning anxiously, shading their faces with their hands, looking from side to side, but none of us could help. None of us knew Annie. Behind the woman now came 3 other women, the same sort of age. One was blonde, 2 dark-haired, and they were all in one-piece bathing suits. They too were shouting Annie, but it seemed somehow clear that they were friends, not the mother. They seemed more purposeful and less paralyzed by fear. The friends kept on going, passing the mother who had stopped. The mother simply stood there in the sand, turning desperately in a circle, looking behind her and calling out again and again, "Annie! Annie!" in a wild, anguished voice. She didn't look at the surf, thundering in over and over below her, but we did. We couldn't help it. We looked horrified at the waves rising slowly up, towering, then crashing down into foam and violence, fearing to see the thing we looked for. The woman started off again, heading down the beach, running slowly. Her cries carried back to us on the wind. "Annie! Annie!" I looked around our circle. No one was settling back down. Parents called to their children, knelt next to them, stood anxiously, then sat down again, alert and straight-backed. They shaded their eyes and scanned the dunes. They looked furtively at the surf. The children stopped their screaming play. The couple next to us had drawn together. The mother in the black bikini had sat up and moved under the umbrella beside her husband. Their little boy sat still, watching, his tank suspended in the air. The woman came back past us again, her feet pounding along the sand, kicking it up with each step. She looked at none of us, none of our children. There was only one shape, one body that was the right one, and she couldn't find it. "Annie!" she cried. "Annie!" It was unbearable to hear it. We could hear how she was beginning to give way. She ran wildly on, past us, back in the direction in which she'd come, still calling out. But before we could even settle down on our knees again, she had made a wide, wild loop in the sand and was running back again. Her arms were held out now, stretched open in the air. The gold bracelet glittered. We were all standing up now, all of us. All the children had stopped their playing. They had become quiet and stood by the bare, sandy legs of their parents. We were all watching the mother. From down the beach beyond her, her friends reappeared, the three of them pounding back down the beach without Annie. They were calling too, still distracted, frightened. Annie! Annie! The woman was nearly in front of us. We could hear her panting as she ran. We could hear how ragged her voice had become. Beyond her, the surf never stopped, those huge green breakers pounding down over and over. The mother never looked at the water. It was as though that was something she denied altogether. She was tiring, you could hear, and hope was running out. The family near us had drawn into a little cluster. The father was standing now with his silent son in his arms. His wife was next to him in the sun, her thick dark hair around her face. She was weeping. She wiped the tears away with her fingers. Then she put her arms around her husband and her child, leaning her head against her husband's shoulder. She closed her eyes and opened them again, looking at the mother who would not stop, who ran and circled about aimlessly again, pounding past us once more on the sand. Annie! Annie! It was a torment. I looked at Diana, but her face was turned away. We were standing too. She had Jennifer held close to her, leaning against her. Jen's arms were wrapped around Diana's thigh. Jen was silent and frightened, her thumb drifting fearfully toward her mouth. Then the mother, running past again, stopped right in front of us, her arms open despairingly. Annie! She called again, and then she sank suddenly down onto her knees. I couldn't bear it. I couldn't bear her giving up, though I could see she'd done everything there was to do. Where else could she go? Her friends had come back, their faces twisted and distorted with the sun, the running, the fear. There was nothing more she could do, the mother. She was on her knees in the sand, and she put her hands up to her face, covering it. It was over. Her friends caught up with her and stood in a circle around her. One of them, with short, tousled blonde hair, stooped over her. She put her hand on the mother's shoulder, speaking to her. The other two women still looked around, squinting against the sun. The shorter one folded her tanned arms aggressively on her chest, as if she could somehow take charge. The other woman took off her sunglasses and set them on top of her head. And they both kept slowly turning and turning, looking around and around, scanning the beach. But the mother stayed on her knees, her face covered with her hands. She shook her head back and forth, crying in a terrible low voice. No one knew what else to do. It was over. Then in the bright, hot glare, a moving figure appeared, a little girl in a white bathing suit coming from the direction of the dunes. She was running through the families scattered across the sand, dodging in and out of them, coming down the beach towards us. As she came closer, the friend with the folded arms said something urgent, and the mother, still kneeling, raised her head. The little girl was running straight for her, and the mother opened her arms. As the little girl reached her, the mother flung her arms around Annie's small body. She closed her eyes and began rocking back and forth. It was over. Now it was over. The woman next to us started to sob openly. She was holding on to her husband and her son. Around me, the women were crying, covering their faces with their hands. The men were silent and stricken. Everyone could feel the rising terror that had pounded through the mother's heart. I looked at Diana and I stepped over next to her, close. She kept her face turned away from me, but it was lowered now, no longer grimly lifted. I put my arm around her and then I put my hand up and took hold of her chin. And I moved her chin gently around so that her face looked into mine. She let me do it. Her eyes were shut. She was crying. I waited. She took a long, gasping breath, and tears flooded down her cheeks. Jennifer, frightened and silent, stood by her leg. "Diana," I whispered, "I love you." She didn't answer. "All right, you win," I whispered. "We'll have another. We'll have 6 more. 10. Now I could see that it was I who'd been wrong and stubborn. All the things I'd thought so solid and weighty, like granite, why it was too soon for another child, why we must wait, and why the decision must be mine and not hers, were now tiny and flimsy, meaningless. They fell away, water sinking into sand, and I felt ashamed. I meant it, what I was saying, but it was too soon for Diana to hear it, or to hear anything that I said. She was still crying hard. Her body was still gusting with sobs. She was still ravished by that anguish, by the terrible vision of what we all fear most, the lost child. It's fear that takes you over. You're helpless before it. It takes you over, sweeps you into that awful curling rise toward the breaking crash. The roar is loud and terrifying in your ears, and you're reminded how weightless you are, how aimless your movements, how brief the moments before the next crash, how you have nothing to hold on to but each other. Thank you.
I think Roxana will take some questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
My comment is related to Sparta, which I read. I didn't have a chance to read your book of short stories, and I only read half of it. So whatever my comments are related to the first half, it may not apply to the second half. Okay. The first thing is Conrad, who is a veteran who just came back from Iraq. I thought, and he has post-traumatic stress disorder, a very severe case of it. I thought you depicted the situation in Iraq very accurately, it seemed to me, and you seem very realistic. Also the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder that you described seemed very real to me, and I thought it was a very good description of the experience of someone coming back from Iraq with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I also felt that you felt very attached to that character, okay? But I had a problem with one part of your book.
Okay.
The problem was the situation that he came back to. To me, it seemed too perfect. It did not seem real. It did not seem like the type of situation that a person, that most people in that circumstance would come back to, although it could happen. Now, here are some of the things that I felt didn't ring true to me. First of all, he comes back and his parents are very nice people. He has 2 siblings that are very nice. They get along. There's no conflict. They have no problems. The only problem is trying to help him out, and they're very supportive of him. Conrad. Okay, he has a girlfriend who waited 4 years for him.
Not exactly. Not exactly.
Yeah.
Well, she went out with different people, but she was still there, and I don't know how the relationship ended, because I'm only through half the book, okay? But okay. What else? He lives in Katona, which is a very wealthy area in Westchester, okay? They live in a very big house. When he comes back, he has plenty of free time. He doesn't have to do anything, right? Which seems strange to me, okay? There's a family that goes to Cape Cod. I mean, it's an ideal situation. I guess I was jealous of it, actually. When I was of Conrad's age, I was not in that kind of a situation, all right? I was very far from it. And there was, to me, it seemed like most people coming back from Iraq come back to a situation where there are more issues they had to deal with than he had. The only main issue, we had two issues, one, well, maybe others, but the main ones, it seemed, was dealing with the post-traumatic stress disorder and then trying to renew his relationship with his girlfriend. And at least up to half the book, he was trying to think about his future. But I think a lot of veterans coming back have other problems. I mean, their parents may not be quite as supportive. They may not live in Katona, New York. They may live in a less affluent area and all kinds of other things.
Yeah.
So I was wondering why you picked that kind of a family situation, and perhaps you disagree with my analysis. You probably do.
Well, everything you say is true. It might. There are lots of vets that don't have that set of circumstances. 1 million people have gone through Iraq since we started this war. They don't all have the same experience. They're not all from the same background. And one of the things that was interesting to me when I did research about this was that so many veterans, now we don't have a draft, so the people who go into the military are people who choose to do it. Now, up until 9/11, a lot of the people who went into the military went in who came from blue-collar backgrounds and who saw the military as a way to reach the middle class. After 9/11, that changed, and there are thousands of people who went in from backgrounds like Conrad's who felt that they wanted to make a statement, a moral commitment. In my generation, people who felt they wanted to make a moral commitment went into the Peace Corps. In Conrad's generation, they go into the Marine Corps. And I met person after person. There's a famous book by a Marine veteran called Nathaniel Fick called One Bullet Away. He went to Dartmouth, was a classics major there. Came from a background like this. There are many people that I talked to who went to New England colleges, who come from families like this, who decided to join the armed services because they wanted to make a difference, because they felt helpless after 9/11, felt that we were under some kind of attack, and chose to deliver their time and energy to protecting what they thought was going to be protecting the country. So you're certainly right. Lots of people don't have this set of circumstances, but a lot of people do as well. Conrad is lucky in some ways. He doesn't have to immediately go to work. There's a place for him at home. His parents are concerned. But that's also, when you read fiction, the writer is asking you for a willing suspension of disbelief. And that means not, did this happen to everyone, but could it happen to someone? So that's what the fiction writer asks of you. You're certainly right. Lots of people had a different experience. But there are people who came from just Conrad's background. And the reason I chose Katona was because I used to live there. So I knew it very well.
Another question. Don't be shy.
Ethan?
I loved your reading. It seems so rare that you get to hear a story from beginning to end, and I loved it. One of the things that you said today at lunch that I thought was really interesting, because the difference between writing novels and short stories for you is that in short stories you always know the ending, so then it's not that you're sort of solving a puzzle sort of backwards, but you know where the story's going to end. And so having listened to this story, I felt like I could sort of pick out sort of those moments that maybe you were sort of had, but I was curious, what was the moment in this particular story you said, okay, that's it right there. That's something that's an image or a moment that I'm going to sort of unpack and move it backwards.
So a friend told me that she had been at the beach and she watched something like this, and it was so powerful. So you can tell every time it gets me, the idea of that mother. And it's just, so, but if you're writing a short story, one strand of narrative is not enough. John Updike said a short story is two unconnected things that collide. So that wouldn't be enough. That would just be a sort of an anecdote if I just wrote about seeing the mother on the beach and collapsing and then the child comes. So there had to be another strand of the narrative. So what works against that is the argument. But what I was going for was that moment of the mother sinking down on her knees, giving up. but I had to bring you, the reader, to that place with both narratives going on, both sources of tension converging on that point. And when I say that I know where this short story is going, there's always a moment like that, and in every one of my stories you find it. There's a kind of bang, but something always happens after that, and I never know what that is going to be. So that's created. That kind of extra little tail is created by the engine of the narrative itself as it works itself towards the ending. So that's the origin of that. And this is for English majors only, but. So when he's remembering the night before when Diana was so indifferent and so infuriating, and she's reading and paying no attention to him, that image is, in my mind, directly drawn from To the Lighthouse when the young, I can't remember the young woman and her husband who get engaged during that visit, and then it describes their later married life. And she does something like she leans her foot against the oven while she's paying no attention to him, and that wifely indifference is so infuriating. It's sort of part of the ending of their marriage. So that, in my mind, that refers to that blooming rage that overtakes the marriage into the lighthouse. So for me, that adds an extra layer of kind of danger to the story. Only you know this.
I know there are people in my class who've read a lot of Roxana's work, so, you guys sure.
Yeah.
I really liked your metaphor with the wave and the whole beach day and representing like fear and family. So I guess once you pick a topic like fear, family, and love or something like that, how do you know what metaphor, what scene you're going to use? Where do you start to compose a story like that?
Okay, so I do it backwards. I don't think of family, fear, beach. I think of, as I say, my friend told me that story, and the woman's sinking down, having given up. So that's what I'm going for. So as you're writing, because you, the writer, you are engaged, you have some emotional connection to this scene. You're writing this scene to deliver this, whatever the feeling is, rage or terror or domestic bliss. So everything you choose to describe will deliver your emotional relationship to it. So because I was already worried as I described them walking down through the dune grass. If you know anything about botany, there's the grass that grows along the beach is called a sedge, and sedges have edges. That's how you know them. Grass is smooth and rounded, but sedges always have this sharp edge. So as I was describing them walking down to the beach, I wanted something, the way I described it was going to include some kind of threat, even if it was just those sharp edges brushing against their legs. They couldn't find a place to park. Everything is leading towards this final moment of terror. So the waves, if I had been writing towards a moment of great happiness, I wouldn't have made the waves so powerful, so high, so dangerous. But because that was in my head, that comes through in every descriptive word that I use. So your emotional feelings will be reflected in the language that you choose to describe it. If you describe, so one of the exercises I give my students is I say, write one page and describe a place informed by grief. And sometimes they do a great job and sometimes they do a terrible job, but the point is to describe a place, and the adjectives and the way you describe that place give us a sense of it. And then I say and describe the same place informed by joy. And the best student ever who did this, I gave him joy first, and he wrote a description of a child's bedroom. It was never spoken that it was a child's bedroom. It was a child's bedroom, and there were 2 chairs on the bed, and the bedspread had been put over the top of them to make, he doesn't say what it is, but it's obvious, and the whole room is filled with stuff that the kids are using. And then I said the same place informed by grief, and it's that same room, and the child is obviously grown, and there are books in a big slide on the floor, and the closet door is open, and there is a fist-sized hole in the back of the closet wall. So just the description and the choice of the adjectives and the way he described it give us a powerful sense of emotion. So that's what you're doing. Let your feelings about the place inform the descriptions.
One more question?
Yeah.
I'm just curious, as somebody who started writing fiction, what was it like to move into writing a full-length biography? Was it hard not to have the sort of a license that you have when you write fiction?
It was really a strange venture, although at that point I had only written one short novel, so it's not as though I had a long career. It suddenly changed. I was trying to write anything I could, and as I said, I was writing about American art because that really interested me. And so one thing I did over and over during the writing of that book was to say to my husband, there's one thing I want you to do for me, and he'd say, okay, what? And I'd say, call my editor and say, I'm not doing this. I've changed my mind. It's just too big. And he would say, he was a lawyer, and he said, you make the task into 100 small steps, and you just do it step by step. But in some ways it was great. I loved doing archival research. I spent a lot of time at the Beinecke, reading other people's mail. Doesn't get any better than that for a fiction writer. And then some of it was really terrible. There were 2 lawsuits going on, so there were people who wouldn't see me. I was ordered off people's property. That part was horrible. But in some ways, it was like writing a novel that I was given all the characters and the plot, and I just had to write the story because it was a great plot and a great set of characters. So in some ways, it was a novelist's dream. And because they were issues that really interested me, the idea of photography emerging as an art, modern art emerging, women in the art world, how O'Keeffe became her own person and separated herself from the rest of the art world. All those things were really interesting to me for all sorts of reasons. So in some ways I felt kind of insulated from what I was trying to do, which was write fiction, and in some ways I was very grateful to have such a great, important, rich, satisfying project to undertake. And it took me over in many ways. And so I used to live in Katona, and one time while I was writing that, I was driving down the main street of Katona, which is about as long as this room, and there was a car approaching me. And I was driving, but I looked up and saw the driver, and I realized it was somebody that I knew, but I couldn't figure out who it was in time to wave. And as he passed, he had round glasses and a bristly mustache, and as he passed, I realized I thought I'd seen Alfred Stieglitz. So I had become completely inhabited by this world. It wouldn't have surprised me at all. Alfred, what did you mean when you said that? So it was odd, and I'm tempted by biography. Again, there are a couple of people I would like to write about, but each time I'm tempted, I also have a novel that I want to write. So far the novels have won.
Can you tell us something about what you're working on now?
No,
Okay.
sorry.
I think it was worth asking.
Thank you for asking. It's always worth asking. But as a novelist, and I know maybe you are not the same way, Lucy, but a lot of novelists that I know find that if you talk about what you're working on, there's some kind of tension that is dissipated if you give it away by word. It's kind of like those tennis courts that get blown up for the winter and you have to go through the airlock. If you tell your friends, all that starts, the whole thing just starts going like that. And when you go back to it, there's nothing there. It doesn't have the substance that you thought it did. So I've learned my lesson, and I don't talk about what I write.
I just figured it was a segue.
But thank you.
If you were doing biographies, you could talk.
Yeah, no, I'm not.
Okay, there are copies of Sparta over there, and I imagine that Roxana would be willing to
I'd be willing.
sign them. And thank you all for coming, and please come again next month.